we do have Information Minister Kojo Oppong Nkrumah on Zoom, and later we will also be speaking to Seydou Abudu. He's president of the Ghanaian community in Niger. He's been on the line with us. We have Smaila Idi Zanze, who is chairman Progressive Onion Sellers Association, also joining us. Kojo Oppong Nkrumah, thank you so very much for making the time to join us. Now, let me give you a sense of how some Ghanaians feel about Ghana's commitment in this process. And it appears Ghana is taking, a certain lead role, including hosting the defense chiefs in the last 2 days here in Accra. Alhaji Suleiman says, I urge all citizens of West Africa to rise and demonstrate against these clueless leaders who have plagued us with their incompetence. If they attempt to send troops to Niger, our generation is indeed suffering from leadership paralysis. Then Albert Senyo says, military action isn't the way to go. Diplomatic engagement will offer the opportunity to resolve military invasions over the last few years. Military invasions over the last few years haven't done any good. It's only worsened the plight of the very people we claimed to be helping. Mohammed Ibrahim says, I think what ECOWAS should do is to stop the Western countries from interfering in African issues. And let's work together as Africans. Osa Bonnie says that the force approach will worsen the situation. It demands a calm approach by meeting all the coup leaders for proper deliberation that could lead to a compromise. What if that is not working? Kwame Ochre says, since the junta refused to hand over back power to the democratically elected government and coups are becoming rampant in West Africa, Nigerian press, or you mean Nigerian president, is held, the Nigerian president is held against his will, including the turmoil that will continue when military is in power. ECOWAS must act now. Good. Dennis Kwafi says this is geopolitics. Whether we join or not, we will still have an interest as to who we support. So I think the president has thought of it and think joining will help us. Nas Neti, they couldn't solve a problem between two clans for 27 years, but you want to go and solve the problem of another country in which majority of the people are not in support of the elected president anymore? Ansong John says, military strategy presupposes political end. All military problems are political, and all political problems are economic. He's quoting Dr. Kwame Nkrumah and says, fix the political ineptitude and economic incompetence first before going to Niger. ECOWAS. Owula Spee says, our soldiers have never fought any war in their lives. Are you sure about that? Except fight police officers and brutalize innocent Ashaman people. Warn the president not to use my tax to deploy our soldiers to this unwanted venture. Ba Real says, who exactly are they restoring the so-called democracy for? The people of Niger are fully in support of the military. Well, there are Nigerians in Ghana who have been telling you that they are not in support. They want President Bazoum back. These so-called leaders are nothing but puppets of the West. We'll explore that other angle and accusation that you have heard Samuel Okudzeto mention. You've heard Professor Kwesi Ening also hint at. I'm not too sure if I recall exactly Professor Sabuaji, making any reference to that, but I'm sure that Dr. Ken Ahosu also appeared to have hinted at that. Now, Laurie says corruption and mismanagement has led Niger into this mess. African states are shivering at the sight of military interventions. Who are shivering at the sight of military intervention should govern devoid of corruption and thievery. Our 60 billion Bank of Ghana saga is enough grounds to trigger us. We should just do the right thing. And a final one from Nana Opoku Ponsa. He says, as a Ghanaian, I am not in support of the decision by the government of Ghana to send our army to Niger. Well, you heard the defense minister. He says they are ready. Anytime the whistle is blown, they will go. The citizens of Niger are speaking to bad leadership and governance. Government of Ghana should focus on the mess in the country and pray same does not fail. We are not angry enough. So, Kojo, it doesn't appear from what we are picking from the streets, at least from what people are telling us on air, that they want our government, to commit to this. But we are actively in the center of it.
Morning, and thanks for the opportunity to be part of this very privileged panel. I haven't seen many of them in a while. I think the last time I saw him was when he gave me a copy of his book on ECOWAS interventions or ECOMOG interventions in West Africa. So it's good to be part of this panel.
Right.
I think if you put a question to any rational person that should ECOWAS use diplomacy or force, I'll be surprised to hear any rational person say force. And I think the kind of responses that you are getting and which you are reading are because of how we have framed this conversation for our people. And in my submissions this morning, I will seek to highlight a few things that I think we should make dominant in our conversation. Now, let me start off by making 3 foundational comments, and I just have 5 points to make. The 3 foundational comments I'll make essentially are that it is appropriate that we are all concerned. We're all concerned about the kind of rhetoric that is coming out of ECOWAS and from citizens and every other place, because, instability is growing and can easily spread across the sub-region. Apart from that, there's also palpable evidence that geopolitics is playing a big role here. And, the West, be it Western Europe or Eastern Europe, is very interested in West Africa for their own economic interests. And now, even more than in times past, conditions are primed to have instability grow a bit further. So it is appropriate that we are all concerned about how this matter is resolved. Secondly, I think also respectfully, any conversation that appears to position this as a choice between diplomacy and force does not do full justice to what ECOWAS is confronted with, and I would explain that further. I think that if we want to help the conversation, we should posit the conversation in its full breadth. If we posit it in a manner that says, should we use diplomacy or force? 1, we will get a very clear answer that says diplomacy. And 2, that will not do full justice to the conversation here. And I know that's why, Dr. Kusini was commenting when I laughed earlier. Number 3 is that I think we need to be very, very, very careful to stick with what we know as fact and then put away conjecture and other things, especially as Sami Kujeto-Blakwa mentioned. There's a lot of propaganda that is being churned out to help various interests. And if you're not careful, you will base arguments on the propaganda and other sentiments and not the fact. But let me speak to my major points that I want to make as we go about this conversation. First of all, I believe, and I share the view that all the concerns that have been raised by the distinguished guests that you have here are legitimate. And those concerns have to be responded to as we go along, except for about 2 or 3 that I quickly think it's important to correct. In Ghana here, at least, it is not fair to make comments that suggest that Parliament is being ignored. In fact, on the 21st of August, 2023, the Ministers of National Security and Foreign Affairs requested to brief the joint committees of Foreign Affairs and Defense and Interior on the development so far and what Ghana was considering. You notice that in my brother Sammy's submissions, that came later. It was not front-loaded. The front-loaded submission suggested that Parliament was being ignored. But here in Ghana, we have briefed at our request, not at our invitation, at our request, the joint committees of Foreign Affairs and Defense and Interior. Again, the suggestion that Article 75 requires some prior parliamentary approval or ratification is incorrect. Article 75 is about treaties and agreements. It is not about contributing to a multilateral engagement, because when you have a multilateral engagement, as has happened in times past, and I can give you a whole retinue of times when Ghana has been involved in multilateral engagements. 2002 in Cote d'Ivoire, 2013 in Mali, 2016, 2017 in Gambia. If it is a multilateral engagement from a body that Ghana is part of, you do not require prior approval, but the decent thing to do, the important thing to do is to engage Parliament first, so that you do full disclosures to Parliament about why you are, a part of this enterprise, what the risks are, how you are mitigating them. And of course, if some financial commitment is required from the Treasury, you will need to get the kind of approval for it. So, as I've mentioned, I agree generally with all the sentiments that have been raised, but just to highlight these specific ones. Now, the concerns, as I mentioned, are very, very, very legitimate. Concerns like what Dr. Or what Colonel Festus Obwaji raised, that are the hands of all ECOWAS countries totally clean as they purport to lecture or intervene in this matter? Or how does ECOWAS answer the questions of financing or funding some parts of this, even as you go along? Questions about how ready are we and whether or not we'll be doing, quote unquote, the dirty job of, Western masters. All of these are legitimate concerns that ECOWAS heads of state and ECOWAS countries owe answers to their populations about if and when we get there. But there is a fact that we are not including in our conversation. And I think that is what is swaying the whole conversation to that side. In fact, if you have, and I know you have, if you have followed, ECOWAS has not said that it is confronted with a choice between diplomacy and military intervention. I haven't heard ECOWAS say that. The two communiques issued by ECOWAS front-load diplomacy. In fact, in the insert of Commissioner Musa that you played, if you listen to what he says, and he's there, he can tell me if I'm misinterpreting him or not. His comments are that when you talk about the item 2, which is a possible use of force, they have answered the questions now. The chiefs of defense staff don't need to meet to examine the modus operandi or the details about the use of force if it comes to that point. They don't intend to meet again on it. They have clarity on when that can be triggered, that is D-Day, if need be. They have clarity on what resources, what they need to use if they have to do that. So the military guys have answered their question, but ECOWAS has not said that it does not have interest in diplomacy. In fact, since this matter happened, the brief I have is that there have been about 5 different diplomatic missions that have moved in. The first was President Talon of Benin, who went in to engage the military right on the onset with the approval of the head of the authority of heads of state. And then you had, I think, on the 30th of July, the Chadian president, Idriss Deby, who also went in with the concurrence of ECOWAS to do the second attempt at diplomacy. The third, if my brief is correct, was on the 2nd of August, the delegation led by the Nigerian head of state, the former head of state, Abubakar Salami, and then the Sultan of Sokoto. That was the delegation that initially they said they were not going to meet, and then subsequently they sent what we understand a very low-ranking officer to go and hear from them. Then on the 9th of August, the Emir of Kano and ex-governor of the central bank, Lamido Sanusi, also then went in with the concurrence of ECOWAS leadership, I am told, to try another diplomatic engagement. Before the 12th of August diplomatic, or can I say a move by the Muslim clerics, Babalawo and the rest, where some apologies came in. And from the brief that the government of Ghana has, ECOWAS is not closed to diplomatic interventions. But something, the reality is that, and I think as has been rightly mentioned, ECOWAS has a lot of work to do, first in terms of its own credentials and image on how it has handled things in times past. True. But one of the lessons that I think ECOWAS has to be humble enough and frontal enough to admit is that the option of naked diplomacy or diplomacy only has not borne the kind of results that we desire. And again, I make the point that the questions about whether everybody's hands are clean, the questions about, what will it cost, they're all legitimate. But they do not take away the fact that ECOWAS has lessons to learn from attempting to use naked diplomacy. And it is in that context that ECOWAS said, let's go ahead with diplomacy. But while we are doing that, let the standby force begin to mobilize. Let there be clarity that despite all the questions they may be within, first of all, the ECOWAS framework, secondly, about the potential for this particular mission, let there be clarity that diplomacy has to succeed. And that if diplomacy does not succeed within a certain time frame, then the use or the possible use of force is not off the table. Something, the fourth item that I want to speak to is that it is important for us, all of us as commentators, to be clear, and I think it has started already in this conversation, that we support democracy. All this sort of insecurity and arbitrary acts across are not things that we support. And therefore, we want to encourage the military junta to see reason on a reasonable diplomatic arrangement with ECOWAS so that ECOWAS will not have to resort to a military intervention. And the risk is this. If the conversation is lopsided towards the risk, we cannot, we should not, what if, why if, we actually undermine the strength of ECOWAS in this entire enterprise. All of those questions are legitimate. They are legitimate risks. They are legitimate questions. But I think that we need to front load the conversation with a call on the military junta, all forces of democracy, with a call on the military junta that it is in our best interest to agree on a democratic, on a diplomatic resolution to this matter, so that we don't have to get to a point where ECOWAS has to bring in military intervention and answer all the military questions. I'll give you, just a bit of data in my final point. It is theoretically and sometimes sentimentally appropriate to raise the question of what causes military coups in various parts of the world, including West Africa. But I think if you look specifically at what has happened in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, they were quite clear on why they did it. And in all of those instances, with the greatest of respect, it was not necessarily about what you call bad governance or unconstitutional rule. In fact, in Burkina, the issue was about security, jihadist elements, and terrorism. And the argument was that the civilian authorities were not being robust enough in dealing with it. And therefore, if the military operatives took over, they could do a better job. We have to ask ourselves a question and look at the hard data. Has the military takeover stabilized, reduced, or rather worsened the jihadist or Islamic incidents there, which was the reason that they gave for it? In Mali, we had the reasons that were given. Those reasons, again, security in nature. In fact, in Niger, and with the greatest of respect, if you go back to the announcement that was given by the persons who executed this coup in Niger, there was not, and there has not been, by the official spokespersons of this enterprise any French claims in this. And that's why I say we have to distinguish between what we know as a fact and the commentary and things that we are seeing around social media. In fact, their premise was two. They talked about jihadism, terrorism, and then what they called economic mismanagement. Across these places, has jihadism, terrorism stabilized, gone down, or worsened? In fact, in Burkina Faso, if you look at the data now, it is worsening. If you look at
even in Niger, there has been an uptick.
Absolutely. If you look at the data from the African Center for Strategic Studies, the data is quite clear that in Mali, the insecurity, terrorist attacks, human rights abuses is actually worsening. And like you rightly mentioned, in Niger, in the last, I think, 1.5 weeks, the data suggests about 35 people have been killed, 17 in one recent attack. So I make the point that and I'll explain why, while theoretically and even sentimentally, it makes sense to have a conversation about the causes and the triggers. If you add that to the specific instances of Burkina, Mali, Niger that we are discussing, what you are doing ends up undermining a certain legitimate conversation, which is that, and I will not say constitutionally, because people can meddle with constitutions and play games, democratically elected governments being overthrown by military adventurists is something that collectively, I think we collectively oppose it. Collectively, we must speak against it. And in this specific case, it has not led to what they claimed it was going to lead to. So to end my submissions, yes, there are legitimate concerns. Ken Officer Zawaji raises them, Questioning raises them, Sami raises them. But I think that the front loading of our commentary should be to encourage the military junta not to play the games that Mali and Burkina have been playing under the guise of diplomacy, but to come to the table with a clear diplomatic, acceptable layout that resolves this matter as quickly as possible.
All right.
My worry is that when we lopside our conversation towards the risks which are legitimate, the challenges which are legitimate, we end up emboldening them and we don't get a strong position enough. Those will be my opening submissions.
All right. Thank you very much. And as you admit, I believe that our panel of experts have been very thorough and their expertise is duly appreciated, and that the discussion is not necessarily lopsided, even though you have a wish and prayer that there will be a certain framing as to what comes first, second, and last. But I think that we can grant them from their backgrounds and wealth of experience what they believe is the best approach.